Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hey, that's what I like.
Use the microphone.
Yeah.
Use the microphone.
You're just jealous. Okay, first of all, a few announcements. We have some panoramic pictures that were taken last year, and they're right up here. You can check with Eloise Nelson. And the prices are, the mounted ones are $30 and the unmounted ones are $20.
Can you get closer to the mic?
Yep, $30 and $20.
You gotta turn it on.
Does that make a difference?
Not yet.
I challenge you to turn this on.
It's right on. There we go. There you go.
Oh man, what would we do without Earl? Okay, the panoramic pictures. Right up here, we took them a year ago, and they're $30 for the mounted ones and $20 for the ones that are rolled up. Just this is a little early perhaps, but the next time we use this facility will be the Advent sermon or service, and that's the first Sunday in Advent. So please plan on coming, and you best dress warmly. It won't be the same temperature. If you should probably take a look at the pictures that are in the interpretive center. They are just beautiful. Their work was done by Bruce Johnson, and it really reflects, I think, the history of the family. Carolyn.
Yeah.
You want a little time?
Oh, sure, to talk about my book?
Yes.
Oh, yay, sure.
Oh, you have a book? Oh, aren't we lucky? Yeah.
Thanks, Ed. I'm Carolyn Mankel-Sawinski. I am the daughter of Orlin and Vivian. In case some of you don't know me, you may remember my parents. I've had the good fortune of taking some of Gabriel Steeny's articles and doing some historic research with them. And my latest book is called Almost Saved But Lost, available on Amazon.com. Just Google my name or Google the title. Put in my name, you'll find it. It's a story about an 1873 blizzard that hit the Midwest and Candioi County, and 12 people in the county died from the blizzard. And so I track their stories. And those stories connect to Norway Lake Township, Arctander Township, Colfax, and then south of Wilmer into Whiteland and Roseland. Oh, and then Roseville in the far east part. So all of the county is connected into this story. I use some of Gabriel Steeny's quotes in here. I quote from the 1905 county history. So you'll learn about local history, you'll learn about the blizzard and the struggles of the people that survived, some of the widows. I've thoroughly enjoyed living with these blizzard people, as I call them, for the last year, writing their stories, trying to document who they were. They were all immigrants, Norwegians and Swedish immigrants, and some Canadians. Documenting their stories. And it's been a joy to write this. I have to thank Gabriel Steeny for this, because without his work, I couldn't do what I do. So anyway, if you're interested at all, Amazon.com. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, now for the history program featuring the Steeny family. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. The planning committee has worked very hard and they've done a very good job. It's going to be informative and enjoyable. But we're first going to sing both of our national anthems, and we'll start out with the American. Yeah, that'd work.
What so proudly we hail at the twilight
Okay, now for Yavielska, I challenge you. Yavi. You got Yavielska? Landet som besiger frän, föredömligt över havet, med i tusen jäm. Älskar det och tänker, och farfar och mor, och den saga natt som sänker, drömmer på vår jord, och den saga natt som sänker drömmer på vår jord. Oh, well done. You all pass.
Yeah, well done for sure.
Okay. There is good news for you. Earl is going to be the MC.
God dag allesammans. Well, Ed and Marlon invited me to be the announcer for the speakers this afternoon, so I'm glad to do that. Maybe I can tell you a little bit how this program came about. I'm on the Heritage Committee of the association, and about 2 years ago, one of our members had an email from a descendant of the Steeny family, and he said he had collected a lot of memorabilia and suggested we should get together and talk it over. Well, it took a year, but in fact we then did meet last September, and the descendant came from Ohio to talk to us, and at the same time we met a local historian who is also very much up on the Steeny family. So it became clear pretty quickly that we would have an excellent program this year if we just leaned on those two people and built around it. So I'm glad to do that, and the first speaker will be Bruce Johnson. As you can see from the screen, he's a great-great-grandson of the Ivor and Inga Steeny, the immigrants who came here. So Bruce, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me in the back okay? Is that loud enough? Okay, thank you. When my mother passed away several years ago, we were cleaning out her house and there was these boxes of Steeny material that somehow she had accumulated, and my sister didn't want them, so I took them, and that's when this whole story kind of started beginning for me. I grew up in Wilmer, but I really didn't have anything much. I had very little to do with Norway Lake growing up, and it was only in later life now that this story has really captivated me. So our story begins not with Ivor and Inga, and I'll try to read, and by the way, whoopsie, where did our picture go? Okay. If I'll have my name and I have some cards so that if anybody wants a copy of this later, you can just send me an email or write me a note, and I'll be glad to send it to you. The Steenys come from the very southwestern tip of Norway. Steiny was the name of the farm, but the I got lost somewhere along the family, and indeed when Ivor first came to this country, the I was not in his name. I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I don't speak any Norwegian. We're really here because of Gabriel today. Gabriel was known as the Pioneer Kid. That was his moniker for his newspaper articles. And he was a very prolific writer about early life from about 1860s to the 1910, 1920s in Norway Lake and Kandiohai County. During my presentation and later on, you'll hear some of the quotes by him. And when those quotes appear, they'll look like this on the screen. I'll read them slowly, and like I said, I can give a copy because I know everybody can't see it clearly. So Gabriel wrote about his father. Ivor G. Steeny was born on November 29, 1821, to parents with very limited means, his father being a parochial schoolmaster. He could remember the hardships in 1825 caused by the crop failure. He recalled the time when bark was peeled from trees, seasoned and dried, and then ground together with barley to substitute for food. So that was obviously a very hard time in Norway. At the same time, in 1825, was the first official recognized immigration of Norwegians to the United States. Johannes Jacobsen Stine, Ivar's uncle, according to family lore. I haven't been able to make that connection with contemporary documents, but I'm going to believe the family stories until we find out something else. But they immigrated in 1825 to the U.S. They became known as the Sloopers, and they're called the Norwegian Mayflower. Johannes was one of the major owners of the Restoration, the ship they came on, and in the photograph you see a replica of it that was made by the Norwegian government to celebrate in the about 40, 50 years ago, I think it was. But it was a very small ship. The 50 passengers each had only 1/3 the space that the Pilgrims had on the Mayflower. That's how small the boat was and how crowded it was. Yet they were at sea for 90 days. When they arrived in New York City, there were 51 passengers because no one had died and one baby had been born during the passage. But the ship lacked the required amount of goods, finished goods. At that time, to immigrate, you had to have so many tons of finished goods to a certain number of passengers. So the ship's captain and Johannes and another one of the owners were imprisoned, and they spent 3 weeks in prison. And it was only because of the local Quakers and the Norwegian consulate and an uproar that was created that eventually President John Quincy Adams pardoned them, and they were able to move on their way. And that was the first time a Stine came to the United States. The second Stines to arrive was Marguerite, or Martha, Ivar's sister, and she was married to Mikkel Knutsen. And they arrived in 1848 to Wisconsin and settled in Bonnet Prairie, Wisconsin, which is located southeast of Portage, a little bit south of the Wisconsin Dells, and northeast of Madison, about an hour. We visited there last year. There is still a Norwegian Lutheran church there, but it is not the church that the Stines, all the churches have been brought together, and there's no township or anything there. But we were able to find Martha and Mikkel's gravestones in the local cemetery. So they'd lived there for the rest of their life. Gabriel wrote, Ivar Stine went into the sheep and goat business, buying and shipping to Bergen, similar to shippers here, by which he made some money and looked for the time he could bring his parents and his sister across to the promised land. So Ivar spent 5 years after his sister immigrated preparing into his finances to be able to come. There was a May Day celebration, and at the top of a greased May Day pole was a bag of money. And whoever got to climb the pole first got the prize. And Ivar was the one who managed to get to the top of the pole first, received the money, and along with what his savings had been up to that point, he was able to buy passage for his parents, his 2 sisters, and his sweetheart and himself. Gabriel writes about the journey. They were 14 weeks on the ocean with nothing in sight but heavens and water. Fresh water supply gave out. Food supply, very little. The worst of all was the cholera broke out on the ship, and many passengers found their journey's terminal in watery grave. They were left at sea. They all began to be familiar with the fact of starvation and death on the ocean. Finally, they reached New York, sick and tired. And of course, the story of the Stines is really the story of everyone's relatives. They just reflect on the times. Wisconsin brought Ivor loss and hope. After the journey through the Great Lakes in 1853, the Steeny party arrived at Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Shortly after leaving the ship, Ivor's sweetheart died and was buried in Milwaukee without a formal religious service. Gabriel wrote, "Now it was Ivor Steeny's sad duty among strangers in a strange land to find a suitable place to bury his youth's treasure. There was one consolation, that he was spared of seeing her sunk into the sea." So the Steeny party trekked the 75 miles to Burnett Prairie, and as soon as they arrived, the night of their arrival, Gulaf Oleston Steeny, who was 71, died that night. So he made the journey all the way to Norway to his son-in-law's home and then immediately perished. So Ivor, his mother Sigrid, and his sisters stayed with the Knutsons. His sisters, Reginald and Carrie, found work as live-in household help, and Ivor worked the fields with his brother-in-law and hired out as a harvest helper. A year later, he became a husband and father. He traveled to Milwaukee to arrange a burial with a minister from his sweetheart, and at the docks, he accidentally met Inga Vold Olsdatter, a newly arrived acquaintance from Norway. And Gabriel wrote, and this is a picture of her from 1860, so a few years after this, "She spied Ivor Steeny and walked right up to him and greeted him. Not recognizing her at first, she said, 'Don't you remember? I awarded you the cash prize upon your good luck in climbing to the top of the greased pole 2 years ago.'" They were married within a year and established their first farm near the brother-in-law. And the year after that, the first child, Gabriel, was born, and in all they had 10 children. The youngest son of the 10 was Robert, and he was born in 1872. So I did the math, and it was probably pretty typical again. In 16 years, she had 10 children. Gabriel wrote, "The first thing for father was to secure a pair of steers. I can remember him having a triangle homemade harrow about 8 feet, and he carried the seed grain, throwing it out by hand. During the harvest, all the hay was cut by scythe and the grain cut by cradle. Mother and us children were along in the field, mother bunching up and tying it into bundles. Taking care of my younger brother and sister was my job." The Steenys, after 6 years, decided to move to Minnesota. And Ivor was very active in the local church, the Hauge Church, and was often leading the songs at any church that he belonged to. And therefore, he became quite active in the synagogue. And in 1862, he was attending a meeting in southeast Minnesota, and he looked at the soil, which was richer and blacker than what he had in Wisconsin, and he decided to purchase a farm close to the local church and minister. So Inga, Ivor, their 4 children, who were at that time 6, 5, 3, and an infant, traveled 152 miles to their first Minnesota farm in Arundel and Fillmore County in the southeast corner of the state. Unfortunately, the well proved unreliable on the farm, and for the next 2 years during the drier months, Ivor had to haul water from 2 miles away. So after 2 years of that, he decided maybe it was time to move again. Unfortunately, let me stop there and read Gabriel's comment first. At a meeting in Arundel, Fillmore County in 1862, Father noticed that the Minnesota soil was far superior to his Wisconsin locality, and that a neighbor of the Reverend A.E. Boynham had his farm for sale. After 7 years farming in Wisconsin, father sold out and moved to Minnesota. The Boynham farm is still there, and there's an 80-acre plot that's not adjacent to it. And we believe that's where the Steeny farm was, because he's later sold it to the Reverend. And it's hard to believe that this piece of land that's off a little bit, that's still part of the Boynham farm, was not part of the Steeny place. They next moved in Minnesota to Asplund in Goodhue County. But again, apparently Ivor didn't learn that it was important to have a reliable well, because he had the same problem again, that the well would go dry. And 2 years later, he started looking for another farm in Minnesota. And it was in 1864, now the Sioux Uprising was over with. The first settlers were coming back into the Norway Lake and the Candiotihie County area. And in 1866, Ivor, along with two other fellows, made a trip up here, and he found at Norway Lake that there was good soil, timber, water, fish, and game in abundance. And he also met the Menkel family and other future neighbors in the community that were already here. And he purchased the Lake Mary homestead. Ivor returned to his family in Goodhue County and made arrangements for their third move to a new farm. On October 28th, 1867, Ivor, a pregnant Inga, and their 6 children reached their final home after 3 weeks of travel, herding their cattle and traveling along the way to get here. Gabriel wrote about the arrival at Norway Lake. Where I was born and raised, there were no Swedes. I heard much about the frontier life and had it fixed in my mind that the Swedes were a tribe, something like the Indians. However, he goes on, long before reaching the Menkel home, we were met by a lady with a smiling and sunny disposition, heartily greeting us and welcoming us to Norway Lake, introducing herself as Mrs. H.W. Menkel. She was a genuine Swede. So he recovered quite nicely. Ivor and Inga spent the rest of their lives on the homestead at Lake Mary. They raised 8 children, lost 2 as infants. That when Gabriel died in 1904, Inga lived for 1 more decade. The farm was inherited by Gabriel, whose writings we've been hearing. And along that farm, Gabriel stayed there, but his brothers and sisters really moved across the entire United States into the West. Some of them ended up in Washington State, Idaho, and even in Texas, where I have to just digress for a little bit because his brother Robert became the chief cartographer for the state of Texas. And I have not seen this map. My sister says she has it, but she never shows it to me because she's afraid I'll steal it now, I think. But cartographers always would sign their maps by putting some insignificant error on the map. And that would tell them that it was their map. And if somebody copied it and that error appeared, they would be able to prove that that person had copied their work. So on the first state map that Robert Steeny drew for the state of Texas, out in the panhandle of Texas, there's a little dot and it says Norway Lake. In 1910, even though Ivor had passed away, Gabriel and Gabriel's oldest son, George, like many other people from the Norway Lake area, the western part of North Dakota had been opened up for homesteading, and I'm sure many have relatives that tried to homestead out there. They were out there for the 5 years to get possession of the land. The picture here shows Ivor and his wife Vilda, who was a Quam, and 3 of their daughters and 1 of their youngest son. Their older children were all still here at the Steeny farm at Norway Lake. And they came back. We're fortunate today. Karen and I stopped by the Steeny farm yesterday because my first cousin Howie had bought the farm from his aunts Claire and Elda in 1971 and still lives there. And today, Howie's daughter Tanya is the 6th generation of the Steenies to work that piece of land. And on October 27th of this year, it will be the 150th anniversary of the day that Ivor and Inga arrived at Norway Lake. So thank you very much. And
Appreciate the talk you put together for us. So Bruce has described the migration from Norway to Norway Lake, and they also had a kind of a churchly migration, as I've been able to read. And Kurt Mankel, where are you, Kurt? You can describe the church migration of his family.
Yeah, let's see. I gotta get out of this one. Let's see. Where is it? There it is. There we go. Oop. I'm used to a mouse. I apologize for this. I'm doing that. There we go. There we go. Sorry. So my name is Kurt Mankel, and as a perfect segue, where's Bruce? I'm one of the Mankel's descendants that he talked about, so that's a good segue. So I'm going to talk about the churches of the Steeny family. There's not a lot of documentation here, but so this will be a little shorter presentation. But Bruce described this pretty well, so I'll kind of go through this real quickly. The Steeny family is from Ireland. They attended meetings of the Hans Nilsson Hauge followers. These were apparently meetings in homes. They didn't have a church at this point. The Hauge church was a low church and less formal. And Ivor and Inga, which Bruce described in great detail, so I learned stuff too, they met at these meetings, and then they married in the U.S. So they actually met at some of these Hauge church meetings. So Ivor and the family moved to Wisconsin in 1853 to Columbia County. Here they met Pastor Elling Eilson of the Hauge Church. And so Ivor and Inga were married by Pastor Eilson in 1855. So again, Bruce, I won't cover this in great detail. They moved to Minnesota, to Fillmore County, and they attended a Hauge church there. And this church had connections to Pastor Eilson. And as Bruce talked about, Ivor was a song leader. And then in 1864, moved to Wanamingo County, or Wanamingo in Goodhue County. But I didn't find a record of any church that they attended. But I'm assuming they had some Hauge church connections there too. And they lived there until 1867. And in 1867, they moved to Lake Anna Township, where apparently among the first, or maybe the very first people to meet, they met were my great-great-grandparents, Herman and Elizabeth Mankel. They lived on the farm just to the east of Section 19 and Section 20. So it kind of makes sense. They came from the east, and so the first people they met here were these Swedes. What was it? The Swedish tribe. So I'm one of those. I'm one of those tribal members, I guess. So they organized a church in the 1860s. Not a lot of documentation on that. They've been lost. The 1905 history says that the records were lost, so the records are gone for over 100 years. They named it the Erlin Church. And that's the name in the 1905 history. I spelled that just out of the the history book. So they changed the name slightly from Ireland to Ireland. So the first known records from 1876. Now this church that was organized had members all over the county, including Lake Andrew, Arctander, Dover, and Green Lake townships. The first pastor was Lars Rusted. The years he was active here was 1869 to 1877. He died on New Year's Eve, 1877, after apparently giving a long sermon where he read the entire book of Revelation. Was that? There's a little bit of conflicting info here. The 1905 history says Pastor Rusted was brought from Fillmore County by Ivor. The history says Ivor went down to Fillmore County to bring him up here. And then Gabriel, in one of his stories, says Pastor Rusted came directly to Kaneohe County from Norway. So I'll kind of trust Gabriel on that. So Pastor Rusted, Gabriel wrote this. He was a forceful speaker and earnest and sincere in his religion and belief, and was looked up to with love and respect. So Rusted had congregations as far away as Sauk Center and Sacred Heart. So he got around. So the first Erland cemetery was laid out on the Steeny farm. And according to my dad, on the north of the Rooter Grove, there was a lone tree out in the field. And I believe that's where he said the first cemetery was plotted. The tree's now gone. So in 1877, they incorporated the church. And its official name is this: Nanested's Congregation of Norway Lake, Kaneohe County, Minnesota, of Haugie's Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Synod. So now we're talking about the Nanested Church. A lot of area immigrants were in Arctander Township, especially, were from Nanested, Norway. This includes the Christofferson family. My grandmother my grandmother, Herman Mankel's wife was Cora Christofferson, so that's part of my heritage too. Also the Holter families. Pastor Lars Rusted was from Nanested. Nanested is actually the next to the Oslo airport. So if you've ever flown in there, you've literally been next to the Nanested municipality. And the Holter Church is a church there where my dad and my sister actually have visited. That's actually 7,000 feet from the end of the runway. So here's the Nanested Church in Arctander Township, and that was built in 1879. And that's the only picture I have. So I don't have a lot of pictures about the church. I could find nothing on the inside. They probably do exist, but I don't know where they are. So here is the map of Arctander Township in 1905. You can see on the very far right, it says Norway Lake. That's actually Jericho. It was called Norway Lake at that time. So 3/4 of a mile west, straight 3/4 of a mile straight west is the Haugie Church. So here's the Holter Church in Nanested, Norway. This picture was taken by my family. I've not visited there, even though I've been to the Oslo airport, and I didn't realize it was that close, by my mistake. So the picture on the left is the Holter Church, and this is straight out of Google, where it says Holter Kirke. Then the left, it says Pentecostal Church. So I'm thinking that means it's still a Haugie church. I'm not quite sure, and Google is never wrong, right? So, and then on the map on the right shows where the Holter Church is, and the Oslo Airport is on the upper right. And that's literally 7,000 feet from the Oslo Airport to the Holter Church. So we're thinking they changed the name because so many people came from there that the Erland name was changed just because of the sheer numbers of people from Nanested. So then the records get even less. The Steenies attended East Norway Lake Lutheran at some point. We're not exactly sure when. Probably after 1885. That's just my guess. It's after 1885 because Gabriel didn't write a lot about the church split. He wrote about some church controversies, but that was more around 1890. So perhaps between 1885 and 1890 is when they started attending that church. So he was the Steeny baptisms started in 1889, And he did write quite a bit about the controversial times within the East Church itself around 1890. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Kurt.
Sure. Should I just turn this off? Or, let's see.
Yeah, I don't know if Barb needs it or not.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you very much,
All right,
Kurt.
thank you.
Appreciate it. Now, earlier I mentioned a local historian who has become very interested in the work of Gabriel Stina, and it's Barb Mossberg Levin. And she has done a lot of work with his writing career, Gabriel's writing career. He was the oldest son and was a writer.
He was a writer.
Among other things. But so please.
Make sure this thing works, because if you can't hear me, it's not worth talking, right? You know, I almost feel like the least qualified person to be standing up here, because number one, I don't have a drop of Norwegian blood in me. And if you would have met me when I was younger, my hair was pitch black, and I didn't really grow up in this area, but I was in this area a lot. And with black hair among all these blonde-haired Swedes and Norwegians, I never fit in. And I still don't. Anyway, my name is Barb Mossberg Levine, and I happened upon Gabriel Stine way back in about 1975. I had a job out at Sibley State Park, and I was this big-eyed, vibrant hiker of the trails and assistant park naturalist. There was an excellent biology teacher there named Lloyd Bakke, and he kind of took me under his arm, and I worked during the summer. And then he suggested, along with Dave Lace, the park manager, that maybe I get a grant and stick around all winter, because I need to save money to go to college. And they said, if you get this grant, you could do some kind of a project. And I thought, well, nobody's got the history of Sibley Park. So I made this proposal and started. It was really simple. I was going to read through all the old newspapers, and any time I came across a name that had been an owner of Sibley what became Sibley property, I'd Xerox copy that article. And in that discovery, or in that process, I started seeing these old Norway Lake reminiscences stories. And the first one I read just made me fall in love with Gabriel Stine like you couldn't believe it. He talked about meeting with some of the old farmers over here at Railson's, because that's where the mail got picked up or delivered once a month on Saturdays. And he's this 8 or 9-year-old kid, and he's tagging along with his dad, and they're waiting for the mail to come. All the farmers have gathered in the area, and he overhears them talking about those 13 that were killed out here at West Lake. And he says he determined right then and there that the next day he was going to hike out there and find out where these 13 were buried. And he'd made arrangements with 2 of his other buddies that they're all 3 going to hike out there. Well, Sunday, the neighbor kid couldn't go. His parents said, oh no, you're staying here, you're going to church. Went to the next farm where the other kid was. Oh no, you're not going anywhere, you're staying here, you're going to church. And so this guy won my heart because of his determination, his grit. This was wide open prairie. There were no home sites. There was nothing except grass that was taller than this kid. And he heads off west to go find these depressions in the ground where 13 people were buried. And then the icing on the cake for me, as it said, he squatted near one of the depressions, and he had a piece of dry crust for a sandwich in his pocket, and he was so overcome with emotion that he couldn't even eat that dry bread. And I thought, oh, who could not love a guy that tells a story with that much passion, that much emotion, and that much richness of history? And so I finished my Sibley Park story, and I had kept a file for my own personal stuff of probably about 30 or 40 of the Gabriel Stine Pioneer Kid stories. And those are all written in, those would have been 1925 to 1927 in the Wilmer Tribune, which was a weekly paper at that time. And since then, I just can't put the guy aside. I spent one winter typing every story because I didn't want to lose them. Those Xerox copies were getting faded, so I thought, these need to be published. People need to have this information because it's so rich and it's so good. And so I typed all those stories. Well, then I lost that set and I had to type them again, but 60 some stories that are, a page and a half. It was a lot of typing. So anyway, since then I have had this appetite to find as many stories as I can. And the earliest stories about history that I found were actually in the Kirkhoven Banner. And that was the year 1923. He published once a week. So for 20 weeks, there was another story by Gabriel Steeny, and he talked about the first settlers, the blizzards, the prairie fires, Indians, and working with the oxen. Well, then, in doing some more study, I went back, not just looking for old Norway Lake reminiscences and the stuff that was in the Kirkhoven paper. I thought, well, Carolyn put me onto a website called Chronicling America, where there are newspapers that are online that you can word search, and I put in Steeny, and here comes some stuff in the early 1900s. 1900 to 1903, I found 5 articles that were all about, or mostly letters to the editor, and they were all about this big church controversy where a pastor Felstead pretty much, there was a division in the church, and there was a huge meeting. He wasn't kicked out, but he decided to leave after that. So there are several stories that Gabriel himself submitted to the paper describing what was actually going on that. And then a couple of years later, I started finding some stuff about School District 104, and I'm going, what the heck is that? School District 104, I'm thinking this is a connection between that and the church thing. Gabriel Steeny proposed or made a petition to the county commissioners that there needed to be another school district between the School District 25 over here and was it 56 over here. And so there were lots of stuff in the paper about that. And then I was interested, well, so when did this guy really start getting interested in writing? And in the like 1909 and 1910, he was putting a little article. You know how you the neighbors in these old newspapers, the neighbors got together and they met over at Mankel's place, or they got together and they met over at Engen's, and a good time was had by all. Wow, this is news for the newspaper. But he wrote a little article called Norway Lake Nibblings. And he'd put some of his stuff about the church and about the neighbors, and that was like a little news column. But this was before he was doing his history stories. And then I started finding news from Bowman County, North Dakota. And at first I was just passing by that stuff going, well, what's that got to do? And then I find Gabriel Steeny's writing these too. And so in the like 1909 to 1921, he was homesteading a place out there in North Dakota, a place called Rame, Bowman County, and a whole bunch of people from Candioi County were out there. So he'd write this little article and send it back to the Wilmer paper saying, so-and-so is doing pretty good, their crops are in, and so-and-so came out to help with the harvest. And I'm going, oh my gosh, this guy's nuts. So in 25 through 27, he wrote 63 articles signed Pioneer Kid that were all about the railroads, the blizzards, the fires, the schools, the farming, and all of that stuff. He was also very involved in politics. Between 1900 and 1917, there were 6 articles where he was talking about the Farmers Nonpartisan League. I don't know enough about early pioneer history to know what that was, but I think it was mostly farmers getting together and making sure they were getting a decent price for their crops. And then he was very interested in the war, which was 1918 and 1919. He was promoting helping our boys over there, support the Red Cross, support the YMCA. And there were 5 articles about that. And then he was also big on prohibition. From 1868 to 1915, he wrote 5 letters to the editor that were, we need to vote for the, the county option. County's got to determine whether they're going to be wet or dry. And he was a very strong proponent for the dry. And I think Canterbury County was dry for up until fairly recently, wasn't it? Yeah. Then the Wilmer Daily Tribune. Oh, he also wrote, Carolyn put me onto this. He wrote hundreds of obituaries. And those obituaries are hard to verify because he didn't sign any of them. But you can see his little sermonizing through some of the stories, his moralizing, he liked to use the word well-known pioneer so-and-so passed away. And so you can identify his stuff, but you can't verify it. So I haven't even begun to keep track of his obituaries. He wrote for the Wilmer Daily Tribune, which came out later. I've got 26 articles that have a title of Trailblazers. And then he did some life sketches where he'd take somebody like Ole Dahl. Ole Dahl was a pioneer that settled before the Sioux Uprising over here by Crook Lake, and Mrs. Iverson, whose husband was killed by the Indians, ends up marrying this Ole Dahl. But Ole Dahl sounds like a crazy guy because he stayed here even after everybody else left, and he supposedly had a Indian wife, and then after a while she left him, and Gabriel Steeney tells this story about Ole Dahl in about 5 or 6 different editions of the newspaper. I better wind this up here. I'm having too much fun. So all in all, the Wilmer Gazette had a bunch of stories, and then the New London Times also had a bunch of stories. I found 9 articles called Past and Present that were written between 1928 and 29 in the New London Times. He also had more news about Bowman County. All in all, and he gave a beautiful obituary in the New London paper about Peter Broberg. And the Pope County Tribune also had the obituary for Ben Iverson, who was part of the team of people that came back for the burial of the 13 out at Munson Lake. So all in all, I have collected 205 stories that Gabriel Steeney wrote about our history, and they are so rich in details of location of where the farms were and who the people were, and their trips to Wilmer and their trips to St. Cloud and their early pioneer life. It has to be published. Amen.
I get the idea that Barb is fascinated by Gabriel Steeney. At this point, we have a musical interlude. Carolyn Sawinski, who has been mentioned, has come prepared with a song. Do you do a cappella? Or?
Shortly prepared, yeah.
Okay.
This is one of my favorite hymns in the hymnal, in the ELCA hymnal. And when I sing this, think about the pioneers that came here and the hardships that they had. And the one thing that they brought was their faith, as evidenced by the original log church, the other churches in the community. Faith was very important to them. So I just have this. The song is called, I Heard the Voice of Jesus Say. I heard the voice of Jesus say, come unto me and rest. Lay down, O weary one, lay down your head upon my breast. I come to Jesus as I was, so weary, worn, and sad. I found in him a resting place, and he has made me glad. I heard the voice of Jesus say, behold, I freely give life-giving stream. My thirst was quenched, my soul revived, and now I live in him. I heard the voice of Jesus say, I am this dark world's light. Look unto me, your morn shall rise, and all your day be bright. I looked to Jesus, and I found in him my star, my sun, and in that light of life I'll walk till traveling days are done.
Okay, now we'll hear some of the writings of Gabriel. You've heard some already, but we'll hear some more so you can get an idea what kind of prose he used. I don't know that he was an educated man, but anyway, he surely had a gift of words. And I think Barb said she had 205 articles. We've picked out 6 to read. And Marlon Henjum deserves the credit or the blame of picking out 6 articles out of these writings. So the first 3 have to do with transportation, actually. And the last 3 have to do with hardships. So the first one then will be John Hansen reading about a transportation article.
Hi. This one's called Untitled. Reverend Lars Olsen Rustad was the first one installed as minister for the Hauges Synod congregation here at Norway Lake. He was a lay preacher from Norway, going through Norway, Sweden, and part of Denmark. He came to America in 1869, direct to Norway Lake, where he proceeded with his ideal work for 2 years and was ordained into the ministry in 1871. He labored here till his death, which occurred in the night, I think, between the old year and the new year of 1877-1878. He was a true type of the Hans Nilsen Hauges faction in Norway, also here. He was a forceful speaker, earnest and sincere in his religion and belief, and was looked up to with love and respect. For my part, personally, I never knew of anyone before him or after who could substitute for Lars Olsen Rustad. He was a real D.L. Moody of Norway Lake in his evangelical preaching and work, and a great deal of Sankey and Bliss when it came to singing. As long as he was driving with a yoke of oxen, a lumber wagon with a piece of board as a seat in pioneer style, he did not get beyond the first zone of his region. But after he got himself a span of horses and something half between a lumber wagon and a 2-seated double wagon, known in those days as a Democrat wagon, he enlarged his field of work. One congregation with a colony where Sacred Heart is now located, one at Lake Lillian, one at Howard Lake, one at Eagle Lake, one at Sauk Center. Norway Lake was his headquarters, where he had his farm and home. Meetings were conducted in the pioneers' shacks and dugouts or wherever convenient. No churches in those days. What remained after him as a direct result from his toil and work was the establishment of 3 congregations: the Hauge Church at Norway Lake, the Hauge Church at Long Lake, and the Hauge Church at Green Lake. There is a peppy little story in connection with this, which I will relate. One day in the fall of 1873, I went to Wilmer with a load of grain. Just as I was ready to go home, Reverend Rustad arrived on the train from Howard Lake, where he had had services the previous day, Sunday. When he saw me, he said, "Good, now I'll get a ride home." We were near neighbors. Those days, when early Wilmer had 7 saloons, 3 accommodating drugstores, and besides that, merchants had a supply of high spirits in their cellars, used as an injection into the slow-going farmers, it found to be a little backward and slow in their business activities, which answered the purpose as calculated. When the farmers got out of there, they felt like buying out the whole stock, or the most of it. They felt like jumping clear over the store from one side to the other, and felt like licking the whole town with one hand tied to their back. But all of a sudden, they went face first to the ground, either as a result of top heaviness or somebody's well-developed fist. When we were ready to go, I drove up to J.P. Moran's store, handed the lines to Rustad to hold while I ran in after a couple of packages. Just then a delegation came out of the cellar. One was Sven L. Mo, with a woman hanging to his coattail, and some other suppliants, all trying to talk at the same time. The woman hanging onto Mo's coattail demanded pay for the whiskey. Mo said he had bought so much at the store he was to have the drinks for free. But she insisted on getting her pay. Mo said, "I'll give you pay." He tore her loose from his coat, landed his fist in her neck, so she went face first to the ground. I jumped to the wagon and took the lines and said, "It's for us to get out of here quick. We will be apt to be entangled into trouble." And so I set off at a lively gait. Sven Mo had evidently also started after us, going the same way. He was overtaken by Sheriff Stoner and Deputy Thomas H. Olson, who was also the son-in-law of Sheriff Stoner, accompanied by Moran, who gave Mo a thrashing, which laid him up for some time. The deputy brought Mo back to Wilmer, while Sheriff Stoner pursued us and overtook us where the Solomon Lake Church now stands on the Norway Lake Road. Driving up to one side of us, he ordered us to stop and read a paper, which included Rustad's name. Rustad wanted to know what this meant. I said, "It's the sheriff. He wants us back in Wilmer, 7 miles. Rustad said, "Ja, men du må si til den. Det var ikke jeg som slog skjærene." I think you must tell him that we didn't punch the woman. I said, "That is not the question. The guilty party is under arrest, and you'll be called upon to witness to say what you saw." The sheriff then went ahead, and we went after him in. But when we got there, we were not wanted. They had come to a mutual agreement out of court. I believe someone had testified to the fact that the woman was so drunk she could not stand up on her own feet without hanging to somebody's coattail. So we were released. We were released and went home. I am very much in favor of writing a complete biography of the esteemed, beloved, and highly respected Reverend L.O. Rustad, the Pioneer Kid.
Next, Eloise Nelson will read a story about a buggy, or more than one buggy, maybe.
Well, before I read the Steenie story, I'd like to just say something regarding, the Swedes being members of a tribe. I'm Swedish. I don't have any Norwegian in me. My husband always teased me that we were a different breed. However, he never accused me of being a member of any tribe. My story is entitled Top Buggies and the Girls, and it was published in the Wilmer Tribune on August 27th, 1926. Evan Railson was one of the very first settlers, and as a rule, first in the different enterprises. He brought in the very first open buggy, which nearly spread like a smallpox epidemic. Also, the first covered top buggy, which created quite a sensation. Farmers stopped their oxen, forgot their worries, and spied as long as it was in sight. Those days, this country has a blessing of bachelors, the fair sex being in demand and at a premium. Some hustled to get a wife. One bachelor, who had stretched his neck nearly out of joint looking for one, had just about given it up for a bad joke when he conceived the cute idea to get a top buggy like Railson's and found it to be a good investment. Now it was the lady's turn to stretch their neck, and it was not long until he had a wife tucked up by his side in his top buggy, and one Miss Gossip exclaimed, "For pity's sake, she did not marry the man, she married the buggy." So you men, old bachelors and widowers, see what you can do about the first installment. Then go and get a glass-enclosed sedan. And if you haven't a wife in a reasonably short time, there is something wrong about the spark plug.
And we have another story about a wagon ride. Norm Handy.
I should mention that the story I'm going to read references District 23, which was a country school, of course, which stood along County Road 40 out here. And it still stands, just barely, but it still stands up here at Roger Hagen's on his property. So my story is entitled "When My Pet Oxen Ran Away with the Preacher." And it was published December 9th, 1925 in the Wilmer Tribune. It was in the month of May, one year in those early pioneer day, the time when the settlers were few and miles apart, the time that preachers or missionaries chose to travel afoot or catch an oxmobile ride between settlers, most of whom lived in dugouts and hillsides, myself included. A.O. Hopegard, then a lay preacher, later ordained to the ministry, and was the well-known Reverend Hopegard of the Haughey Synod. He was a father of the well-known Dr. Hopegard, formerly of New London. He came to our place traveling afoot, from place to place, holding religious services in the new settlers' shacks and dugouts. On his laid-out route, he had for his next stop the name of Johannes Moe, a respectable family of pioneers in Norway Lake Township who lived in a dugout like the rest. He asked the direction and the distance, and Father said, "Well, it's 6 or 7 miles, but you don't have to walk." He said, "Have you horses?" "No," Father said, "but something next to it. A yoke of oxen that can leave you behind in walking, and I have a good driver." I listened to the conversation, just anxious to go, driving oxen, which was my hobby sport. I soon had the yoke on the oxen and hitched to the wagon. Spring seats were a luxury in those days, and it was a luxury we did not have. I found, as usual, a piece of board laid across the wagon box, which was rather short, and we were seated nicely and started off between what is now the Norway Lake store and Ole Knutsen's place in Arctander. For 4 miles, there were no settlers, all wild prairie. Arriving at the spot where now stands the Smehaugen place, we overtook another ox driver moving along with a pair of slow oxen. My oxen were fast and trained to pass all the other oxen on the road, but were docile, nice, and well broke, obeying every order. I asked the other driver if he would turn off a little or stop and let us by. Well, he began sassing us and said, "There's plenty of room on the prairie." I stretched my neck and glanced over his wagon box and noticed he also had a partner with him in the shape of a little brown jug, nicely tucked away in the corner, which was a true companion those days, going to town as empty and lightheaded as its master and returning from town as full as its master. This accounted for the glibby oratory and vocabulary demonstrations. I laid my whip gently over the off ox and said, "Come on, buck," which was all that was needed. The oxen knew the rest and speeded off at a runaway gait, believing they were doing their duty and awaiting further orders. But I had become so foolish, I could not control either myself or the oxen. The short seat board fell down. The preacher went head over to the rear of the wagon box. When I glanced back, he was on all four, bumping up and down like a sack of hay, hanging on to his hat, umbrella, and hand grip with a pair of eyes which would do credit to any Wild West show. Every time I glanced back, I met that wild-eyed look, asking for mercy. For goodness sake, stop them oxen! They were trailing along till we got to a ravine south and west from Edward Rue's house, now stands, where I noticed the wagon began to run on two right side wheels, nearly tipping over. I then came to myself, reorganized, jumped to the other side of the box, and gave oxen orders for slacking, which they did at the first word. Getting up on the level east from where Schoolhouse 23, best known as the Scary Schoolhouse, I noticed the wagon box had worked ahead about a foot. I stopped the oxen and asked if the preacher take one side of the box and I'll take the other and we'll lift it back in position. He asked, "How far is it left?" I said, 2 miles. He said, "Oh, you can be excused now. I will walk the balance." "You did well. I thank you for what you've done." I said, "No, the orders were to bring you through, and I shall do it." With a sad look and sigh, he said, "Can you control those oxen, my boy?" "Yes," I said, "to perfection. You need not worry." "Well," he said, "I hope I'll be spared such an experience I just had." We reorganized, were seated, and everything went fine. But the worst was to come, although not the fault of me or the oxen.
A lot of humor in his writings. The next three pieces have to do with hardships, pioneer hardships. So Jeff, you're next. There he is. Jeff Johnson.
As Earl said, it wasn't always fun and frolic out here in the Norway Lake prairies. So this was published in 1926, and Gabriel goes on to write, "In 1876, just 50 years ago this summer, I was again sent over the prairies to Granite Falls to set up the threshing machinery. The country across that I drove was then dotted with settlers' shacks, but very few and far apart. My destination was a farmer by the river by the name of Lars Lowe. That afternoon was clear with bright sunshine, a day in June. Getting within 4 miles of my destination, all of a sudden I was puzzled. It all of a sudden looked to me like an eclipse of the sun. Just what's happening tomorrow. Soon the grasshoppers began descending like thick snowflakes in a snowstorm. They were some full-grown beasts, heavy and sharp as iron when they hit me in the face. Then they dug their feet in for another jump. I've been out in different kinds of storms, but that was the worst storm that I ever had experienced. Horses would not even go against it. I had to turn into the wind. I had a good supply of handkerchiefs with me. I put one over the eyes of each of the horses and one over my own face, and then we proceeded. The horses crushed grasshoppers at every step, and the buggy wheel tires were smeared with the crushed grasshoppers. It was the most hideous sight a person can even imagine. You could see the edge of the fields blighting away in front of those hungry little eaters, greedy as they could be. It was evidence that the harvest was already done, and all except one of the farmers refused to have the machines even set up in their fields. That one was on what was known as the Paul Thory farm, a little northwest of where Granite Falls now stands. Because it was a cash deal, he said that I might just as well set it up, as he might have some use of the mower for his hay, and the hoppers couldn't eat the mower. But Paul Thory, he wasn't there. He had traded his farm off to Evan Railson, of Norway Lake who had traded it for the Thomas Osmondson farm on the Norway Lake shore, now known as the Halverson Beach. I now had to return home. The work of the grasshoppers was plainly visible the entire way. At Norway Lake, just as anywhere else, if you left your harnesses outside, the hoppers would eat them. If you left a coat or a vest or a sack outside, they'd eat the surface so completely that you could pick the entire thing apart with your fingers. They had soon completed the harvest forest, all the way down to even the blades of grass in the pastures. And then they did their dirty deeds. They laid eggs, and a good supply of them. And then they up and flew away. So in the spring of 1877, the farmers, being farmers what they are, full of hope, they said, yeah, this will be good. And so in good faith, they again put another crop in the ground, just as they always did. But the fields from spring on looked like an ant pile. The eggs started to hatch, and those greedy little eaters, at first just 1/8 of an inch long, they kept the fields black all summer, so bare that at harvest time it looked like you just plowed them in the spring. No harvesting, no threshing, you couldn't even get hay. But that year, as soon as they got growed up, these grasshoppers, they up and flew away. They got wings, and they went down the road to the next field, somewhere else in another county, perhaps another state. No eggs were laid that year, so we got rid of them for the future, and they never came back. The third year, 1878, the farmers had to go to the government and get state aid just to put their crops in the ground. They could not buy seed out of what they didn't have anything to sell. That year, because of the fact there was no crop the year before, all they raised was straw. The ground was too rich. The grain lodged and the heads were very light. Couldn't hardly get enough there for seed for the following year and have something to live off of. These 3 years were hard and trying years to everybody, but this differed according to their circumstances. Some left the farm and didn't come back. Some were able to tough it out. They had enough put aside. So like the old saying, when troubles come, they don't always come singly, but sometimes they double up. Pioneer Kid.
Thank you, Jeff. Bruce mentioned earlier that Gabriel had written about blizzard. So now we'll hear about the blizzard. Carolyn and Eric Huttlested are going to team up and read this story.
This story was published in the Wilmer Tribune on December 23rd of 1925. In the early pioneer days, we did not skip to town to a grocery store to get a sack of flour when needed, like now. We filled sacks of wheat and went to the mill to grind, getting flour, middlings, and bran from our own wheat, the mill charging a toll. Those days, overshoes were not known in the country. They were a luxury used only by doctors and ministers. Moccasins were all the go. Some used them as shoes, others as boots. A handful of dry hay in the bottom kept feet wonderfully warm. Good overcoats were not known. Homemade coats out of sheepskins were begrudged by many who did not have them.
One day, the flour supply was reported low, and Father was sickly. I was just 15 years and was full of pep. I just wished and hoped that they would let me go, and my wish was granted. I filled sacks in the evening and got prepared for an early start. Mother prepared a big lunch basket, but I was too kiddish to take it along. I intended to get an early start and get home for an early supper, and took only 2 slices of bread with me. At 3 o'clock in the morning, or night rather, my pet oxen and myself were enjoying a night promenade. After going 10 miles, we reached New London Mill at sunrise, finding the mill closed for repairs. Piles of grist were heaped up inside and outside. I'd just made up my mind to return home when I met Leonard Larson and Tulloch Johnson of south of where Belgrade is now, each with a yoke of oxen. No Belgrade, no railroad then, but sparsely settled country. When they heard of the mill being closed, they decided to go to the Green Lake Mill further south. Getting such good company, I decided to go with them. Here's where Mother's big lunch basket would have come in handy. Had to live off 2 days on 2 slices of bread. We got there quite early, but did not get our grists ground until during the night. Spent the night in the mill, sitting, walking, talking, and trying to sleep on sacks. Seems to me I can still hear the grind of the millstones yet. Had with us a night companion who said he'd come 75 miles to Green Lake Mill to grind a load, hauled from someplace in Yellow Medicine County.
In the morning, we were off again, homeward bound. Getting to New London, I had to part with my good companions. They went north and I went west. It was a fine, lovely afternoon. But as I got to the east end of Lake Andrew, I saw a roll in the air indicating another of those horrible pioneer storms starting with melting snow. I knew what it meant. Just as the storm struck me, Elbert Hedin passed me with a pair of spry young horses. Well, then there was tears in my eyes. I wished I could get home as fast as he did. But I had to be content with my gait. I then had 6 more miles home and did not see the oxen more than one time till I got home. I put away my whip, gave full control to the oxen, and hung to the hind end gate. At times I could not see the load on the box. I heard a jingle of bells. I jumped on the load as quick as a cat when I saw a neck yoke, a tongue, and a pair of horses' heads right over me, and had the end gate broken eventually by a horse's knee. If I had not heard the bells, I would have been run down and killed. Seeing there was an obstruction in the road, the driver turned off and passed me. I never found out who he was.
Lake Andrew was unusually long that day. Got over it and onto Mid-Lake. Got over the lake to Andrew Railson's first pioneer location. He was also our postmaster. He was just doing chores. Being on the edge of the grove and in a hollow, it seemed as if the storm was over. He asked me to stop, but I was bent for home and said, "I can see the oxen now the first time since the storm hit me," and said, "I can also see the sun. It's about noon." He could not make me stop. I said, "I'm on our timber road where we haul fence posts and rails every day, and both the oxen and myself know the road to the rod. But if Andrew Railson had taken full charge of the oxen, given me a good whipping, and sent me into the warm house, he would have conferred a great favor on me. For I didn't know what I was up against. I have never been so close to death in my life."
When I got on Section 17 over what is now known as the Halverson Hill, south of the Halverson Beach, where the wind had a clear right-of-way over Norway Lake and clean sweep over them hills at a terrific rate, I could feel the wind going right through me. I clung to the box all the time, but my fingers now got numb and stiff. I had to cling to the box with one hand and pound the other to keep blood in circulation. I lost my grip and was not able to catch up again, and was wondering at the gait the oxen took. I did not realize the real fact that the oxen kept their common gait. The fault was with myself. I was so completely tuckered out and was not able to keep up anymore. First, only 2 slices of bread in 2 days. No restaurants then. Then, all that traveling in a sheepskin coat that was too large for me, making walking very difficult. To add to the difficulty, the wool on the coat filled with ice and snow to the skin, making it quite a luggage. The worst of it was I was overcome with a heavy, drowsy feeling, had only one desire, that to lie down and go to sleep, and that would have been the finish. I'm not in shape to check up or analyze the human mechanism, but I have been, so far as I know by experience, and am confident that freezing to death is an easy death. You get exhausted and tuckered out. You cannot resist that drowsy sleep. You have only one desire in spite of anything and everything. You will lie down to sleep, and that is the finish. You will not know you are dying.
That was the point I had gotten to when I was happily surprised to hear Father's voice. In spite of his sickness, he had, by the aid of a long stick in both hands, been able to trail the road 1 mile in midwinter. The roads were on level with the surface of the snow, so no snow lodged in the road. That was the way he traced it, and that was the way the oxen could keep the road. He said he had just stopped with the intention to return when the oxen butted up against him, and he stopped them, knowing the outfit. But he was horrified to see they came without a driver. He shouted, and I heard him, and answered, but being hard of hearing, he did not hear me. I finally staggered up to the sleigh. Father was crying, both over joy to see me coming and for blaming himself for sending me off. I said, "It's not your fault. I wanted to go." He said, "Get up on the load and I'll take the oxen." The storm was so fierce we could hardly see each other. I said, "I cannot go on the load. I'm nearly frozen now." He took the lee side of the wind and said, "Hang onto the box like I do and follow my steps." That way, step by step, we got home. But if it had been half a mile further, I would not have gotten home alive. My feet would absolutely not carry me up any more, and if I had gone on the load, I would have perished there. We were living in a thick grove. Getting in there, we did not notice the storm a bit, only heavy snowing. I walked up to give the oxen their usual petting, but they were covered with a blanket of snow and ice a couple of inches thick. I went in front of them, and the only way by which I could know them was by their horns. It puzzled me how they could find the road, as their eyes were large balls of snow and ice, and icicles 6 or 7 inches long were hanging down from their mouths. I took a good look at them and said, "Good old heroes, you have done well." Making a review of the trip from start to finish was too much for boyish feelings, and tears ran down my chin, and I went weeping into the house.
What a poignant story. He came close to his end that day. Final piece, Lisa McBrien. She is here, right here, and it has to do with Indians.
So the name of this story is A False Indian Scare, and there is no date citation. In those early pioneer days, just after the Indian scramble and tragedies, people were easily frightened, especially women and children. I can remember how slow we were about going to sleep. We feared Indians, had no guarantee for that we ever would see daylight anymore, but be a prey for the Indians like so many others. Amund Severson with his family moved into Norway Lake from Iowa in the spring of 1866. No pasture law. Fields had to be protected by fences, dogs, and children. In the spring of 1867, Carl Severson, 11, brother Albert and little sister Inger, both younger, were stationed on the Crook Lake Pass, a narrow ridge the width of a wagon track between Crook Lake and the Chippewa Slough, to watch the cattle and sheep from going across eastward. One day they spied 6 Indians. They cuddled down on the ground. Carl took his little sister by the arm and sped off as fast as their legs would let them. Albert was not in so much of a hurry. He wanted to take a look at the Indians. He had heard so much about them and wanted to see what they looked like. Pretty soon he also got the trot spell. They all came home short of breath, telling of the sight. People at the house, however, did not pay much attention till they saw the 6 Indians coming along the same way, carrying with them 2 canoes. Then they took it more seriously. Amund Severson and his oldest son, S.A. Severson, then 20, took to protection with guns and any fighting device available. The family ran over to the Peter Nordin claim, now the home of Carl Danielson, where Axel Nordin, the well-known judge A.F. Nordin, was plowing with the yoke of oxen. He was batching at the time. He unhitched the oxen from the plow, hitched them to a wagon, and brought them in a hurry over to Sven Borgen's, now Gunder Swenson's. Meanwhile, Amund Severson and son S.A. Severson were on duty hiding behind some big stones, and the Indians heading for Swenson Lake. Rush orders were sent to neighbors, and a bunch was soon gathered at Gunder Swenson's. Tom Osmundson, Johannes and Halvar Halvardsson, Christopher Engen, Axel and Albert Hedin, with Evan Railson as the captain of the mob. At that time, Amund Severson and S.A. were also present. Also, 6 land hunters looking for locations, of which Johannes Johnson was one who located on the Mamre Prairie. Having the former tragedies so fresh in mind, they began to figure on another refuge at the well-known Isle of Refuge in Norway Lake. Evan Railson headed the bunch and proposed to see the Redskins face to face. This they did, and the whole thing was settled. It was only 6 friendly, harmless Chippewa Indians on their usual hunting, trapping, and fishing expedition. Finding that the whole flurry was about them, they went north of Norway Lake near Games Lake, where they camped for a long time, and where they went no one knows. But it is believed that they were the last Indians seen around here on their old hunting grounds.
Well, thank you so much to the speakers, Bruce, Kurt, Barb, and to our readers. I thought they did a tremendous job in reading those speeches. Ed, we finished just as it's starting to rain here. So.
The timing's perfect. A couple of things, quick things. We have a couple of visitors here. Probably will take the prize for the farthest away. The Wallhoods, Steve and Todd. They came from Washington, state of Washington. And the second thing is, I think Howard Larson is here. Okay, yes, Howard. You see the building in front of us here? We went out in the woods, we cut down 60 logs to build that building. 30 of them came from Howard's farm. Round of applause. It's time for left side.
Our treasurer says we cannot skip the offering.
Oh.
Just can't skip it.
Well, dig deep. Yeah.
Why don't you ask how many that are here today are Stevie relatives?
Raise your hand. Raise your hand.
How many Stevie relatives? Bruce, raise your hand. Stevie relatives. I'm just curious.
About what? Close to a dozen?
Well, as many as I thought.
Thanks for coming.